I see the numbers rolling up. We had quite a few registrations for today's event, plus the folks that are joining us live on YouTube. So if you can just give us a few minutes while people are rolling in, that would be great. We also apologize for the delay. Normally, we like to start right on time, a little technical issue. We're all good now. So I'm going to go ahead and get started. If you are familiar with these events, you might be used to seeing my colleague, Alexia Brewster. We actually gave her some PTO. So I'm Amy Orlov, and I'm the Director of Professional Programs at Forte. Today's session is part of our Business Essentials series. The series features faculty and experts from our partner MBA programs to explore topics from a gender lens that are specifically relevant to today's working professional. And honestly, what can be more relevant than negotiations? As businesses become more and more complex and dynamic, as there are ever-shifting expectations around leadership, flexibility, and equity, professionals need strong negotiation skills to advocate for themselves, to navigate conflict, and to build collaborative solutions. That's why we're so thrilled that today's session is sponsored by the McDonough School of Business at Georgetown University. I'm excited to dive in, and I'm just going to turn it right over to our featured speaker, Dr. Renée Kathawalla. Dr. Kathawalla, please, I'm going to stop sharing my screen so you can share yours, and if you could take it away.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Amy. Great to be here with you all. Let me go ahead and get the screen sharing all set up here. Okay, so let's see. All right. Is this correct?
This is perfect. Thank you so much.
Great. Thanks for clarifying. Hi, everyone. I'm Renée Kathawalla. I'm currently a visiting assistant professor at Georgetown, where I teach classes on organizational behavior, problem solving, and of course, negotiations. So I'm excited to be here with you today to talk about a topic that's really near and dear to my heart, because a lot of my work is looking at how people learn, change, and grow over time, both as individuals, but also within groups and organizations. And so the internal aspect of negotiations is something that I'm really interested in and passionate about. So today we're going to be talking about how we navigate tensions of negotiating, particularly as it pertains to being a woman. So just to give you a roadmap of how we'll use the time, we'll start by talking a little bit about what is a negotiation and how do you know what you want, because knowing what you want is a crucial first step in getting a successful negotiation outcome. We'll talk about the sources of internal conflict, which is really what drives a lot of that tension that a lot of us experience when we're engaging in negotiations. We'll talk about the implications that are unique to women. And then how can we navigate that? What are some tools that we can maybe use? And I'll try to leave you with something that you can hopefully implement as you go on for your, from your day to day and moving forward. And just a couple of quick caveats. One is that I do use gender binary terms because that's how the research has categorized this. So I just want to, state that outright. That's primarily how research has looked at negotiations. And the other is that the internal conflict that we're going to talk about is not at all unique just to women, but there are certain reasons why from societal perceptions and things like that, that it is kind of unique for women. So we'll talk more about that as well. But I just wanted to kind of clarify that before we dive in. So if I were to ask you all, like, what comes to mind when you think about negotiations, what words or images, you might think of things like this. So if we were to imagine kind of a Wordle, I'm guessing we would see a lot of things pertaining to contracts, job offers, salary negotiations, promotions, things that tend to be very formal negotiations, often in the workplace. But also we might see things like handshake or images like, the tug of war, people on different sides of the table, kind of in a back and forth, oftentimes adversarial, like in the picture where they're pointing at each other. And that's one way of thinking about negotiation. It's kind of the prototype that's in a lot of our minds. But the reality is that negotiation is something that we do much more often. It's a much more expansive and broader set of conversations that we engage in. So we might think about them as back and forth communications designed to reach an agreement with multiple parties. You could either have two parties or multiple, infinite parties, or simply as a means of getting what you want from others, which requires you to also know what you want. And so the reality is that we're really constantly negotiating things that are both big and small, personal and professional. It's not just the promotions and salary negotiations, job titles, things like that. We're constantly negotiating lots of different things. So we might think about it in sort of this 2 by 2 matrix here, where in the professional context, we might think about small issues like how do we balance non-promotable tasks with colleagues? Especially for women, we know that women often take on an undue amount of non-promotable tasks, things like organizing events for the team or for the office, or doing some of the coordinating tasks or more service-oriented tasks. Like in academia, we have a lot of service-oriented things that are a part of the job, but when it comes time to decide if you're promotable or not, those things don't really count. And women do often do an unfair share of that. And so thinking about how we might negotiate that if we realize we're doing more than we want to be doing or than we feel like is fair. Negotiating things like work schedules and internal deadlines if you're working on a team and trying to decide, how can we organize the timing so that, we hand things off at the right time and, working when it works for some people versus other people, scheduling calls around the right time, things that seem really small, but over time, especially if you're engaging in repeated interactions with people, can really add up and make a difference in your work situation. Small issues on the personal side of things could be things like balancing household chores and tasks with partners, roommates, whomever. Some of you may have done this as recently as this morning, if you are like me. Again, small things, but over time can add up. Also, things that we might not think about as negotiations are things like weekend social plans. Like, are we going to spend time doing outdoor things, indoor things? Are we going to mostly relax, or are we going to have a big social weekend? Are we going to have time alone? On this bigger side of things, though, professional context is more of what we tend to think about. Things like negotiating a new job or a promotion, new responsibilities associated with that job, and of course, compensation, asking for things like raises or negotiating compensation when you're taking a new job. And bigger things on the personal side of things could include marriage. Like, do we want to get married? What do we think that's going to look like? How are we going to deal with our finances? How do we think about saving versus spending? Parenting decisions. Do we want kids? Do we not want them? How do we think we might want to parent? Those are all really big issues that are also negotiations that we might think about in negotiation terms, but because it's in that personal context, sometimes we might not think about it in that same sort of strategic sense in terms of how we prepare and how we engage with the other party in the way that we would in the professional context. So on the women's side of things, the historical narrative with negotiations is that women don't ask. Like, women don't ask for the things that they want. And a lot of this comes back to this original study in 2006 that found that among graduating MBA students, nearly 52% of males negotiated their starting salary, where only 12.5% of women did. And part of that, or a result of that, was at least partly because the women didn't ask. And so their salaries often ended up being up to 8.5% lower than men. And so that was often used to help explain why we have the gender wage gap. Oh, women just don't ask for more. But it's also things that are non-monetary or less clearly monetary in nature. Something as simple as an example, somebody who was like a partner at a big consulting firm who didn't realize that she was able to fly business class when she was traveling internationally or for long trips, had been flying economy, showing up to meetings super tired, and just didn't know, like never asked if she could fly business class, and then realized that was like a standard practice at the firm, but no one told her, she never asked. So it's, again, it ranges everything from, things that we might not even think about up to the salary, and promotion side of things. So that's the historical narrative. And a big part of that, of course, is knowing what you want. So knowing how much you want your starting salary to be, or how much you want, this promotion to be. Knowing that you want to show up to the meeting feeling refreshed. And I think flying business class is going to help me accomplish that. Whatever that is, you have to know what you want, or negotiations aren't probably going to land as well in your favor as they could have otherwise. And it seems like a simple question, but oftentimes it's really not. And there are a few reasons for that. So one is what you want is basically, we might think about it as your goal in the negotiation, and we might have multiple goals simultaneously. We might want something that's, immediate, like right now, this is my goal, but if I get this now, it might hurt me in the long term, or trying to balance short-term and long-term interests. Thinking about the different outcomes we want, is it quantitative, like Do I know? Is it immeasurable? Like, yes, I got the promotion. No, I didn't. Here's my salary, something you can actually measure. Or is it more qualitative, like negotiating, like sharing tasks or work schedules or finding more work-life balance? And sometimes that's not that clear. And sometimes, a lot of times actually, we often experience internal conflict about those things ourselves. So I think there are really four key areas that we might think about as sources of that internal conflict that can make it really difficult to know what you want and to negotiate effectively to get what you want. So the first source is ambivalence, which is really defined as simultaneously positive and negative orientations towards an object or the thing that you're trying to do. So we often think about ambivalence as like uncertainty or kind of not caring one way or another. But that's actually not the most precise definition. It really is when you have, like, at the same time, you really want something, but you also really don't want it. Like you're conflicted about, positive and negative orientations towards that thing. There also is conflict, of course, between short-term versus long-term. Oftentimes, you might have something that you want right this minute, like if you're negotiating with a partner about household chores and the thing you really want in this moment is for them to hear that you're frustrated or upset that they didn't do what they said they were going to do. And that might conflict with your desire to build a, solid partnership or relationship that's going to help create more balance of chores over time. So oftentimes this is really like when you get in the heat of the argument or the negotiation, which is not always an argument, it shouldn't always be an argument, but sometimes it is, that you have that immediate reaction that can sometimes get in the way. There's also the idea of being seen as, and this is, I think, when the thing that you want, or the act of advocating for that thing risks your being seen in an undesirable way. And this is particularly difficult for women who stereotypically tend to be seen as, people who care more about being a good team player, being cooperative, and society often does expect women to display more of that. And so sometimes the act of advocating for yourself can also get in the way of other people seeing you in the way that either you want to be seen or the way you feel society wants to see you. Again, and this is not true for every single individual person, but as a trend, societally, that's often the case. And then the last source, I think, is like what I call the shoulds. And this is when it's not clear to you if it's something that you actually want or if it's something you feel that you should want. So, for example, if you have gone to get your MBA at a great school and you feel proud of your accomplishment, it could be that you end up feeling like you should want to be on the partner track, or you should want to take that, really high paying job in, a big company, or you should want a job that's going to be really intense and make you travel a lot. Or you might feel like, well, I should want children. I should want, to do this, that, or the other thing. And a lot of those come from different societal expectations, both professionally, but also personally. And if you haven't decided really for yourself, if you have a little bit of uncertainty or lack of clarity about which priorities you really care about, then it's really hard to negotiate for what you want. And there are a couple, so we might think about this like on two levels. So one is, of course, on the conscious level. And usually if something is conscious, like we can reason through it. So if you're like, hey, I know that if I argue for this vacation time that I really want right now, if I'm trying to negotiate to get time off because I really want to do this trip, then I know that's also going to conflict with maybe the way I get perceived at my annual review. That's probably something that's going to be more in your conscious mind. And so you can reason through that pretty clearly, as long as you're aware of it. But oftentimes, a lot of these things are at a deeper unconscious level, especially things getting into that, like the societal should versus is it something I really want? And then like the experience of feeling ambivalence, those things often kind of get buried, sometimes just right below the surface, where like if you pause and you're really honest with yourself, you know it. But sometimes it's not until you've done some really deep inner work or you've encountered a scenario that has made it clear to you that you have some ambivalence, it might be really difficult. So the reason this is challenging is that when we experience, unconscious internal tensions, our minds really don't like that. So we've developed defense mechanisms to prevent ourselves from experiencing the anxiety that comes up when we have these conflicting internal feelings. And so one of those is what we call splitting. which is when we take something, when, imagine feeling ambivalent about something, like having children, right? Something where maybe you feel ambivalence, like it's something you think you really want, but you also know it's going to really cost you professionally or personally or whatever. And you might, if you haven't really worked through that, right, say like, well, there's one part of that that's good or desirable. Let's say, I don't know, having kids is the good or desirable thing. And then not having kids is the bad or undesirable thing. Because your mind doesn't want to hold both of those realities together at the same time. Even though it's very possible and quite honestly, probably likely for a lot of people to feel both of those at the same time, our minds don't like that. And so what happens is we split that into two, and then it's often coupled with this other defense mechanism called projection, where the thing that we've labeled as bad, we project onto another person. So if we have a female coworker, for example, who has decided that she doesn't want to have kids and is really clear about it, we might project onto that person the perception of, whatever we've deemed to be bad onto that other person. When really it's all stuff that's going on within our own minds, but we haven't really sorted that out. And this is where things can get really complicated. Because then as soon as you're kind of lost in this splitting and projection dynamic, you can really lose yourself. And oftentimes the negotiation or trying to understand what you want from that negotiation gets very muddied in your own mind. All right, so what are some of the challenges? Like, why does this actually make things more difficult for women in particular? So, one, this is kind of getting to that idea of being seen as. Research shows that there is a backlash or a social cost to women who negotiate. So, there's often a trade off between being seen as likable versus competent. And this is most powerful when female stereotypes get activated. So, for example, imagine this is from an experimental study where they had women, a scenario where it was either a woman or a man who had an emergency come up with their family at home. And the woman had to make the choice to either leave work and go deal with the child emergency or stay at work. And it turns out that when women chose to go to the work or chose to go to take care of the child and leave work, they were seen as incompetent or less competent, but likable. And if they chose to stay at work, guess what? They were seen as competent, but unlikable. So in a lot of ways, it was really a lose-lose for women. But men, when the protagonist of the experiment was a man, there was not that same trade-off. It was actually a pretty neutral perception whether the man chose to go home or stay at work. And that's just a reality that people face, that women in particular face. And so navigating that can be difficult. There's also research that shows that women who initiate salary negotiations are perceived as more demanding, less nice, and less desirable to work with. So if we think again about that idea of being seen as, it can make it more difficult and create incentives for women not to negotiate because there is a risk of being seen in a negative light. Interestingly, over the last 20 years or so, research has gotten out, the word has gotten out, and women know that part of the problem is that they don't ask for things, at least, historically. And now women actually do ask. So more recent research has shown that among recent MBA grads, women actually initiate salary discussions and negotiations more than males, but they're still paid less. So it raises some interesting questions about that historical, wage gap. And it's kind of unclear, like, how much is it really because women don't ask? Or is it that now women know they don't ask, they're trying to ask, but the act of asking activates those negative stereotypes in a way that undermines them as well? It's really hard to know exactly what's going on, but it is interesting to know that women are asking more. The other one that I think is really interesting to think about, especially when we think about our own like internal ambivalence or the shoulds around some of the work family things, is that it's great that women have advanced so much in the workplace, but one of the challenges or downsides of that is that it's also coincided with a devaluing of caregiving tasks. So it's basically started saying like, well, if you're a smart, educated woman, you should want to have a high-powered job and focus on your career and doing things like caring for the family, whether that's children, partners, aging parents, whatever it may be, that those things are seen as less than. And there's some really interesting recent work on that. And the narrative around work-family conflict is often seen as something that is like particularly powerful for women. And to some extent, that's true, again, because partly of this societal stereotypes around who's expected to do caregiving versus what might be biological necessities in some cases. But it's often seen as something that's more of a problem for women. But the reality is that men do actually also experience work-family conflict, but the way they deal with it sometimes is by engaging in their own splitting and projection. So I'm not going to read this whole quote just because of time, but essentially it's from a study that was looking at how men experience work-family conflict. And so in this study, the interviewee was a high-powered male partner at a consulting firm who was talking about the experience of when his first daughter was born and how he just said he fell like chemically in love with her and couldn't imagine the world without her. And then immediately he goes back to basically saying, I can imagine how women feel this tension of not wanting to go back to work. Even though he was the one who was experiencing like this really intense emotional experience, it was almost like that didn't belong to him. That was for the women. So instead of just saying like, man, it was really hard for me to leave my daughter and go back to work, in his mind, it was like, well, that was the woman's issue. So again, that's also like a difficult inverse of the work-family conflict that it might be something that men don't get to experience in the same way. They have to kind of suppress it and project it onto women, but then women take it on. Um, okay, so what can we do with all this? So I have one sort of tool to leave you with to deal with navigating your own internal conflict. And I think of that this is like a slow down acronym. So the first part of it is the S is for stop. So just stopping what you're doing. We're going to go through this a little bit more. Second is listen. Third is own. And the last part is to wonder. All right, so what does that mean? So the first stop is just like the second you have any kind of inclination that you're having internal tension or conflicting thoughts or narratives about what you want from the negotiation, just to stop. Like, don't go on autopilot. Notice that the conflict is there and just take a step back. First things first. Secondly, like once you have noticed that, listen. So some of the questions you might want to ask yourself are things like, well, what's going on in my mind right now? What can I articulate about the internal conflict I'm experiencing? Can I label where it's coming from? Am I experiencing ambivalence? Like, am I feeling positive and negative orientations about this thing that I want? Am I feeling like I really want this job, but I also know it's going to be really intense and I don't know if I want that trade-off? Is the promotion worth it? Is the salary worth it? Is it about a short-term versus long-term trade-off? Is it about, that I'm worried about being seen as something that conflicts with how I want to be seen? Or is it about the shoulds, something I think I should want, but maybe I don't actually want, and it's hard to reconcile that within myself and to other people. Third is to own it. This is a really difficult part of it. But once you've just stopped and kind of listened to yourself, then it's good to ask yourself something like, what about this is difficult to face? Is it difficult that I feel like I'm not going to live up to my potential or I'm going to disappoint other people? What are the difficult or uncomfortable thoughts that I need to own? Like maybe I do want something different than I think I should want. And how can I be okay with that and own that for myself? And then lastly, how can I hold that tension? How can I allow myself to acknowledge that I have these positive and negative feelings at the same time? And instead of trying to resolve it in a way that's quite frankly often unresolvable, to just let those things coexist. And the last part is to wonder. So this is where it's helpful to get curious. Like, are there ways I might think about this differently? Can I reframe this negotiation so that I can still hold on to my own reality while also getting clarity about what I want? Like, how can I let that be my own story and not let other people perceive, their perceptions of it sway my own internal perceptions? And are there other perspectives I can consider? Like, am I thinking about this through like a tunnel visioned perspective that, I can reframe it in some other way that feels more expansive? So just to wrap things up, getting what you want in a negotiation really does start with having clarity about what it is that you want. And there's oftentimes more conflict than we realize if we really stop to think about it. And the important part is there is a cost to not being clear. So if we skip through these parts, or if we're not aware of times when we feel internal conflict, then it does put us at risk of not getting a really good outcome because we are less likely to advocate strongly for the thing that we want. We might be more susceptible to getting swayed by other people. or just kind of losing ourselves in that process. And so it is helpful to realize like there's a cost to it. And so it's helpful to say like, okay, this is actually important. It's worth taking the time to think through it, even if it's difficult. And introspective questioning, like the slow process I just walked through, can be helpful in clarifying what you want, or at least making sense of your own thoughts in a way that you may not have. So with that in mind, think about, what is it that you want and ask for it. And so that's sort of the end. I know we'll open it up for questions now, but I do have my email here, and I think that'll be shared as well. But I hope this was interesting and helpful and thought-provoking for you, and I'm looking forward to your questions.
First of all, that was amazing. I have this page of notes. I then started typing my notes, so I know that the questions are already coming into the Q&A, but I can't resist. I have to ask one of my own first, maybe two of my own first. So if you do have questions, please put them in the chat. But I thought what was so interesting is when you said a lot of times we don't know what we want when we negotiate, right? But we also don't know what we don't know.
Mhm.
So, how can leaders within organizations or organizations themselves help those who are trying to advocate for themselves? Like, how can they put in systems or create ways that this information is readily available so we even know what to ask for?
That's an excellent question. Excellent question. So I I think that in some ways it really there might be ways of sort of structuring knowledge and conversations within the organizations. Like the example I think that might help illustrate this idea is the partner at the consulting firm who didn't know she could fly business class and didn't even think about asking for it. Having some sort of safe space or whatever it may be, um, whether that's informal mentorship relationships or even maybe a formalized document after you understand like people are having similar questions, to get a sense of like what are there are things that people who have been in that organization long enough have learned? Like, hey, you actually can ask for this. Hey, you can negotiate your schedule or, things that you may not have even known to ask for, but you won't know that unless other people share. And I think that is also something that kind of gets to the culture of the organization, and the dynamics between like female mentors and colleagues, is how generous and willing people are able to be about saying like, hey, just so you know, I asked for this other thing, or, this is where I started when I was here. And I know not every organization has that kind of culture, but if it's somebody who's in a leadership role, I think they can really play a huge role in setting the tone for having open dialogue and helping women within the organization understand like, here's what you can really ask for. As opposed to just like kind of letting them fly blind. And it gets difficult because I think over time, like as a leader, you take for granted the things that you didn't know, and now you
Right.
just know them. um, but if you have a space where women can ask questions or just kind of talk informally to realize like, oh, I can't believe I never thought to tell you, yeah, you can negotiate, you can ask to fly business class. So that's sort of my quick answer, but I do think it's a difficult one.
No, I love that. I remember we had an intern working at Forte, and she looked around during her summer internship. She was at an investment bank, and she said there was no one to ask whether or not she could wear short sleeves. And right, and it was but that brings me to I know that we're trying to do more and more for our women's ERGs at our partner companies. And what a great role for them, right? To have those FAQ sheets or to host like, what you need to know in your first 60 days,
Yeah.
those kind of sessions at work. That would be amazing. I do have questions. I'm gonna be good and hold because we have a lot more coming in, and
Okay.
I want to get to our audience's questions. Um, this is a quick one, and I'm not sure if you have an answer. Sal, you mentioned the study that showed that salary negotiation rate for women was about 12.5%. That was in 2006. Do you know what it is now?
I don't know what it is now. I could actually look. The exact numbers are probably in the study that I have in a footnote here. But I'm guessing, let's assume that the male rate is still around 52%. I'm guessing it's at least like 55 or more, if I had to guess, but I could easily look that up.
Yeah, that would be great. And we'd be happy to put that in like when we post this afterwards, we'd be happy to put that in. So thank you. I appreciate that.
Happy to look that up. Yeah.
Okay, another great question. This slow process, your slow process, implies a lot of time in one's head when I assume there's another human being across from you that you need to interact, with. Um, should you be doing this prior to the moment of negotiation, during? What is your advice?
Excellent question. Yes. And that's one thing, speaking of things you don't know, not, to ask for. Yes. That is something I think about that as something that you definitely need to do as you were going into a negotiation. So if you're in the heat of the moment, um, it's going to be difficult to go through that process because you're going to have a response right away. So
Yeah,
it's most useful when you're preparing for a negotiation that you've been anticipating and thinking about. But that doesn't mean that it has to be one of those bigger formal things. Like, let's say you're thinking about negotiating like household chores with a roommate or a partner. If like that's something where it might come up in the heat of the moment, but if it's happened enough times that you need to work through it, you can think about it in advance and like kind of plan in your own mind and almost like role play. I think role playing is extremely helpful. Um, when something happens, how might you address it? And if you've
yeah,
gone through this process mentally, like internally beforehand, then when the situation does arise, you're in a better position to respond. But of course, if it's something that's like in the middle of the moment, it's going to be really difficult to be like, hold on, let me slow down a little bit. So it's
yeah.
definitely a preparation tool.
Okay, great. Thank you. Thank you for that. Next question. I've seen research that the reason women do not negotiate or ask as much is because they are more likely to experience backlash and they know it. How does navigating that backlash factor into how women have to adapt negotiations?
Yeah. So one of the things is that if women have typically it's helpful for women to lean into the stereotypes. Unfortunately, I think it's partly just a reality of the world that we live in. But one example of that might be that women often, there's actually experimental studies that have shown that women are more successful at negotiating when they are negotiating on behalf of another person compared to a man. And so and that's partly because they're also playing into the idea of like being likable, being a team player, thinking about other people. And so if you're negotiating maybe for like, whether it's a salary raise or anything, explaining why that whatever the thing you want is going to help you better serve the organization, better serve the team. That is something that a lot of women do use to help overcome the potential backlash because you're still getting what you want, hopefully, but you're asking for it in a way that doesn't conflict with what people think they need to see from a female. And I say unfortunately because, like, in an ideal world, we wouldn't have to do that. But
Right.
if this is the world that we live in, that is one tool that women can use to both get what they want without trying to minimize the backlash.
And it's funny because I'm also following the chat, not just the Q&A, and someone had already typed in a suggestion and said, tip from her manager, when asking for a promotion raise, make sure you focus on the impact you have in the company.
Yeah,
And that sounds very much like what you were just saying.
absolutely.
I will tell you that every time I look, there's 3 more questions in the queue. So keep them coming. How do PTSD from unsuccessful negotiations in the past and imposter syndrome affect future negotiations women may make?
So that's such a good question. I think even asking that question puts people at an advantage because it's acknowledging that there is a historical pattern or even template that maybe has become ingrained in your mind
Right.
that could affect future negotiations. I would say there are people who have had bad experiences, but don't really think through them in that kind of a way. And then it does like really powerfully impact them in ways that often kind of undermine them in the future. So I would say it depends on what actually happened, but I think it's a very helpful learning opportunity to try to step back and think about like, all right, what was it that happened in that negotiation? Was it who was involved? What were the dynamics at play? Was it a negative reaction to the thing that I asked for? Was it a negative reaction to the way I approached it? Was it something about the other person? Because we talked a little bit about the idea of splitting and projection. And one of the things that's helpful to keep in mind is that's not only going in our head, that's happening in other people's as well. So it's possible if you're negotiating with someone who's experiencing their own internal ambivalence, that you might get caught up in their splitting and projection. And so is that part of what played into it? So I think it's helpful to kind of, to the extent that you can, really reflect on what was it that really happened. And then in future situations, like, are there patterns from the past that I might notice in the midst of a negotiation so that I can be more mindful and handle it differently, knowing that you can only control your part of it. You can't control what the other person does
Right.
or how they react. But I think understanding patterns and trying to like use everything, whether it was a good negotiation outcome or a bad one, as a learning opportunity, and give yourself the grace to try again, and continue learning.
Right. Right. Thank you. Thank you for that. Um, this is a question I've struggled with this too. I find it difficult. This is I'm reading, but I'm feeling with the words. I find it difficult to find the words during a negotiation. Where can I find scripts to help me build this muscle?
Good question. Okay, so a couple of things. One is if you have someone who is like a good if it's a work scenario, let's just assume that, like a work colleague that you trust and they know what you're going through, like to the extent that you can role play with them, it's so helpful. Um, like tell them like, hey, I want you to pretend to be this person or embody these traits. And practice that. The more you practice it, it feels awkward, it sounds silly, but it's unbelievable how much that can help you in the moment because you've already said the words, you have anticipated what you think the other person is going to say to you, especially if it's somebody that you already know. It's obviously more difficult if you don't know the other person.
Right.
But the other thing I will say is I don't have a lot of experience with using this tool, but I do know that ChatGPT apparently has a negotiations tool. I don't know if anyone has used it. But they have like a thing where you can practice negotiating with it. So it has like an AI sort of back and forth. So I don't know if you can give it scenarios, but I know it's a little option that I've like played around with a long time ago. So it's been a while. So I don't, maybe it's gotten better, but that also might be an interesting tool. Like maybe it comes up with something different than what you would have thought if you told a friend or a colleague to role play with you. It's worth looking into.
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. That's great. I'm gonna be looking that up. And speaking of kind of, losing the words, any techniques to stay calm when you see that your negotiation is not going in your favor?
Yeah, I mean, this is cliche, but I would just say pausing and taking that deep breath. Um, if you have mentally prepared for the possibility of, getting emotional, then when it does happen, I think you're much more likely to benefit from like taking that quick pause and deep breath. Um, I think refocusing on, all right, what is it that we're actually trying to do and figure out like, have we veered away from the actual negotiation? Has this taken a turn? Like, are we talking about something? Are we really talking about the thing we think we're talking about? And also, I mean, depending on what's going on, depending on the dynamics, the context, like the situation, um, it might be okay to say, like, let's revisit this, tomorrow or in a little bit. Can we take some time to digest, think about it, and reconvene? I think that depending on what you're negotiating and who you're negotiating with, um, that can be a helpful thing for both parties,
Yeah.
especially if you feel like you've taken a turn.
Yeah, great. And one more question from the audience. Pay transparency laws have been helpful in anchoring pay expectations, but they're flawed. Sometimes the ranges are so wide they're meaningless or maximums that are artificially low. How do we navigate to get a fuller information set?
Yeah, that's excellent. And I think that's a really important trade-off because it can almost backfire to have that information, especially if it's deflated. And I can say from personal experience, I do think that that's the case. Um, I think that to the extent that you know other people in the industry who are willing to be transparent, at least that's the only thing I have found is that aside from, doing research and seeing like from job postings or things that are publicly available, is asking other people. So from negotiating, my own salary and job titles, job starting salaries, I learned a lot from other women who told me more about what they were offered, things they negotiated. And I benefited from their transparency, but that like there wasn't a lot I could control. It might be possible that women, either for their organizational like dynamics or for their own personal dynamics, don't want to share that information. Um, but I would say if you can find other people and ask, and it's always okay to say, like, can I ask? And it's totally fine if you don't feel comfortable answering, but I'm just trying to do my own research here. That's honestly the best thing I found. And it's still flawed and imperfect. But it's also good. It's good to know in your mind that that's something, some other way to consult, because if you take the publicly available information at face value, then you probably will be at a disadvantage.
Uh, Dr. Kathawalla, that was thank you so much for not only the presentation but for answering our questions. Huge shout out to Georgetown's McDonough School for sharing you with us. I absolutely loved this session. I just want to take a moment and share with the group some upcoming presentations we have in the month of May. It's a busy month at Forte because we have a lot of live events. In terms of virtual, there's actually only one that I want to point out because it's kind of related to the idea of like negotiations and it's the art of telling your career story, right? Which is it's with our career coach Diane Fenig, but when thinking about going into a negotiation, you want to remember who you are, what you bring to the table, how you talk about your past experiences. And it just seemed like the fact that this is coming up next week was such a great fit for that. So I hope everyone will join us for the art of telling your career story on May 14th. With that, I'm going to say a final thank you. The thank yous are also coming in the chat. Everyone loved this presentation. We really appreciate your time and we really appreciate Georgetown, as I said, sharing you with us. Thank you
Wonderful.
so much, everyone.
Amy, and feel free to reach out if anyone has questions. So thank you
Thank
for
you.
digging into Forte.
Thank you.